Imagine a country where, for years, going out at night was a death sentence. A place where entire neighborhoods were controlled by gangs so violent that even the police dared not enter. Where people's lives were worth less than a cell phone, and where extortion, kidnapping, and executions were part of daily life. This was El Salvador, once considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world. But suddenly, everything began to change. What happened? How did one of the most violent countries in Latin America transform into an experiment in security that's shocking the world? The answer has a name. Nayib Bukele, a president who calls himself the coolest dictator in the world. In just a few years, he has arrested more than 75,000 people, put thousands of suspected criminals behind bars, and imposed a surveillance regime so strict that many now call it a modern police state. But is this strategy really working, or are we witnessing the birth of a new kind of dictatorship? And that's not the only controversy surrounding El Salvador. In an unexpected move, the country became the first in the world to adopt Bitcoin as official currency, betting big on a digital economy that so far has been a real shot in the dark. Today, we're going to dive into the dark history of El Salvador, understand how it became one of the most violent countries on the planet, analyze the strategies that have changed this landscape, and uncover the secrets behind the most controversial government in Latin America. But first, let's understand where this small country, now catching the world's attention, is located. El Salvador may be one of the smallest countries in the Americas, covering only 21,000 square kilometers, but its importance goes far beyond its size. Located in Central America, it shares borders with Honduras and Guatemala, and is bathed by the Pacific Ocean. With a population of over 6 million people, it's one of the most densely populated countries on the continent. The tropical climate means El Salvador experiences high temperatures year-round, but it also places the country in the path of hurricanes and earthquakes, making it extremely vulnerable to natural disasters. But the challenges don't stop there. Despite being an independent nation, El Salvador has always been strongly influenced by the United States, both economically and politically. The US dollar has been the country's official currency since 2001, and a large part of the economy relies on the remittances sent by Salvadorans living in the US. But how did this small country, squeezed between drug cartels and political instability, become one of the most dangerous places in the world? To understand this, we need to go back in time and dive into El Salvador's brutal history, where wars, massacres, and bloodthirsty gangs shaped the country's reality. El Salvador's history is marked by blood, wars, and a constant struggle for power. Before the Spanish colonizers arrived, the territory was inhabited by the Papiles, a people descended from the Aztecs who fiercely resisted foreign domination. But, as happened across much of the Americas, the Spaniards massacred and enslaved the indigenous population, exploiting the land for cacao and coffee cultivation, riches that never benefited the rightful landowners. In the 19th century, El Salvador gained its independence from Spain, but freedom brought a new problem: the concentration of land in the hands of a wealthy white elite. While a few prospered, the majority of the population, comprised of poor peasants and indigenous people, lived in miserable conditions. Discontent grew over the years, and in 1932, a great peasant revolt was brutally repressed by the government, resulting in the massacre of over 30,000 people. This event, known as La Matanza, wiped out almost the entire indigenous population of the country and imposed a regime of terror that would last for decades. But the worst was yet to come. Between 1980 and 1992, El Salvador plunged into a bloody civil war where the government, supported by the United States, fought against left-wing guerrillas. It was 12 years of terror, with summary executions, torture, and brutal massacres, such as the El Mozote massacre, where around 1,000 civilians were killed by the army. In the end, a peace agreement was signed, but the country was left devastated, with no infrastructure, no jobs, and a corrupt government incapable of rebuilding the nation. It was in this chaotic scenario that criminal gangs took control of the streets. With extreme poverty and a lack of opportunities, Thousands of young people were recruited by the Maras, violent criminal factions that terrorized the country. The problem worsened when, in the 90s, the United States deported thousands of Salvadoran criminals back to the country. Out of control, these gangs grew rapidly, turning El Salvador into a true battlefield. For decades, the population lived under the rule of fear. Extortion, murders, and kidnappings became routine, and stepping into a neighborhood controlled by a rival gang was an invitation to death. The country became one of the most violent in the world, with homicide rates exceeding 100 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, a number more typical of a war zone. It was in this desperate situation that a new name emerged, promising to end the gang terror and bring peace to the country: Nayib Bukele. Young, charismatic, and bold, he took office with a total war against crime message. But his radical measures have garnered both praise and criticism. Did El Salvador finally find a path to peace, or did it simply trade one form of oppression for another? Before diving into the controversial Bukele era, let's explore another side of El Salvador that many don't know: its natural beauty, paradisiacal beaches, and a growing tourism industry, even amidst a turbulent past. Despite its turbulent past, El Salvador is beginning to stand out as an emerging tourist destination. Its beaches are considered some of the best in the world for surfing. Its forests hide active volcanoes and stunning trails, and its vibrant culture offers an authentic experience for those seeking something beyond the typical Latin American hotspots. For surf lovers, El Tunco is a true paradise. Located along the surf route, this small coastal village attracts surfers from all over the world who come to challenge the perfect waves of the Pacific Ocean. The relaxed atmosphere, seaside bars, and breathtaking sunsets make it one of the most sought-after tourist spots in the country. But if you're looking for something wilder, Playa El Zani offers a more isolated experience, ideal for those who want to escape the crowds and enjoy nature. In addition to the beaches, El Salvador boasts one of the most impressive volcanic routes in Central America. Cerro Verde National Park is home to three massive volcanoes: Izalco, Santa Ana, and Cerro Verde. The Santa Ana volcano, the most famous, offers a trail that leads to its crater, where a turquoise blue lake is formed, an otherworldly sight and one of the most photographed scenes in the country. For history and archaeology enthusiasts, El Salvador also hides fascinating secrets. The ancient Maya city of Joya de Serén, known as the Pompeii of the Americas, was buried under volcanic ash more than 1,400 years ago, preserving remarkable details of daily life in the Maya civilization. This city was discovered only in 1976, and archaeologists are still uncovering incredible traces of this lost civilization. But not everything is perfect. Despite the growth in tourism, safety remains a sensitive issue. While Bukele has drastically reduced street violence, the police presence and climate of surveillance are still part of everyday life. Tourists often report safe experiences, but many still hesitate to visit a country that, until a few years ago, was among the most dangerous in the world. El Salvador is trying to reinvent itself, betting on tourism that values its natural and cultural beauty. But this transformation comes at a price, and it is directly linked to the drastic changes President Bukele has imposed on the country. Now, it's time to discuss how this leader, with such radical methods, managed to change the reality of a country that, not long ago, was ruled by fear. El Salvador's economy is as full of ups and downs as its history. Despite being a small country, its strategic location in Central America and recent bold moves have put it at the center of global attention. But the big question is, are these changes really improving the lives of Salvadorans, or are they just creating a new economic bubble ready to burst? Historically, El Salvador has always had a fragile economy, heavily dependent on three main factors: coffee exports, remittances sent by Salvadorans living abroad, and more recently, its experiment with Bitcoin. Since 2001, the country adopted the US dollar as its official currency, which brought monetary stability, but also limited the government's ability to control its own economy. And that's precisely why President Nayib Bukele decided to do something unprecedented. Make El Salvador the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as its official currency. The Bitcoin bet was announced as a major technological leap and a step toward economic independence. The government created the Chivo digital wallet, gave out $30 in Bitcoin to every citizen, and encouraged the use of the cryptocurrency in commerce. However, the reality was far different from what Bukele promised. Bitcoin's value plummeted after the adoption, and the country lost millions in investments. Moreover, most Salvadorans simply didn't trust the new currency and continued using the US dollar for their daily purchases. Meanwhile, the economy still faces huge challenges. The average monthly income of a worker in El Salvador is about $365, barely covering basic living costs. For instance, a simple apartment in the center of the capital, San Salvador, can cost between $250 and $500, depending on the location. Basic food expenses for one person are around $150 per month. In other words, for many Salvadorans, the struggle to survive remains a daily challenge. Even so, Bukele continues to bet big on his projects. Beyond Bitcoin, he announced the creation of Bitcoin City, a futuristic, tax-free city powered by geothermal energy from volcanoes. The idea sounds straight out of a science fiction movie, but many experts question whether this is just a marketing ploy to attract investors and mask the country's real problems. Amid all this, El Salvador still faces a major dilemma. On one hand, Bukele has drastically reduced violence, which is already having a positive impact on the economy and tourism. On the other hand, his authoritarian policies, lack of transparency, and risky spending raise doubts about the sustainability of this Salvadoran miracle. But before jumping to conclusions, we need to talk about the most controversial side of all this: the accusations of authoritarianism, the mass imprisonment of thousands of people, and the fear that El Salvador is swapping one form of dictatorship for another, this time a governmental one. Let's now explore the darker side of this administration and understand what's really going on in the country. Behind the historic drop in crime rates, El Salvador has become a true police state. Since Nayib Bukele took office, the country has undergone a radical transformation, and this change came at a cost. In his war against gangs, the government implemented such an intense repression regime that today, El Salvador has one of the largest prison populations in the world. But does the end of violence really justify the means? The turning point came in 2022, when Bukele declared a state of emergency that suspended basic rights, such as freedom of assembly and the right to a fair trial. In less than 2 years, more than 75,000 people were imprisoned, a number so high that it surpassed the country's prison capacity. To solve this, the government built the largest prison in the Americas, called the Terrorism Confinement Center, with space for 40,000 detainees. The images from this prison shocked the world. Endless lines of prisoners with shaved heads, shirtless, handcuffed, and packed together like human commodities. Bukele argues that these mass imprisonments were essential for the success of a security policy. Indeed, the numbers don't lie. El Salvador, which once had a homicide rate of over 100 deaths per 100,000 people, now is one of the lowest in Latin America. But critics warn that thousands of innocent people have been imprisoned without evidence, victims of a system that seeks quick results at any cost. Reports of torture, disappearances, and executions inside prisons are raising concerns about the country's future. Beyond the repression, Bukele has been accused of attacking democracy. He dismissed judges from the Supreme Court, eliminated political opposition, and changed laws to allow his re-election, something previously prohibited by the Salvadoran Constitution. His government has tight control over the media, and any criticism of the president can lead to persecution or censorship. For many, he is creating a new kind of dictatorship, disguised as efficiency and modernity. But as controversial as he may be, Bukele remains extremely popular. With an approval rating above 80%, He has become a political phenomenon, and many Salvadorans truly believe that he is the only one capable of keeping the country safe. For a people who lived for decades terrorized by gangs, peace, even if imposed with an iron fist, is still a relief. El Salvador is living through a unique moment in its history. After decades of extreme violence, the country is finally experiencing a sense of security that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Nayib Bukele has achieved something no other government had before, weakening the gangs and giving the streets back to the people. But the big question remains, at what cost? Bukele's model may have worked in the short term, but is it sustainable? Governing based on fear and authoritarianism can bring quick results, but over time, the population may begin to question how much they're willing to give up their individual freedoms in exchange for security. Additionally, the country's economy still faces enormous challenges, and the Bitcoin experiment, which promised to revolutionize everything, has yet to deliver the expected results. The future of El Salvador is still uncertain, but one thing is undeniable. The country has never been talked about more on the international stage. Whether as an example of crime-fighting success or as a warning about the risks of authoritarian governments, the world is watching every step of this political experiment. If Bukele is indeed building a new El Salvador, he'll need to ensure that this transformation is sustainable, not just based on fear, but on true prosperity for all. The country has already faced wars, dictatorships, and the rule of crime. Now, the question is whether this new phase will lead to real peace or just be another chapter before the next major crisis. And you, what do you think? Has El Salvador finally found its redemption? Or is it just living through a new type of prison where the bars are invisible, yet still very real? Time will tell.